Natural beekeeping for beginners. No chemicals, no sugar feeding, not even buying a single bee to start your hive. In this complete guide, Dr. Leo Sharaskin is going to walk us step by step through how to start a hive by catching locally adapted swarms of bees. He's going to explain the advantages of various beehive models, flow hives versus vertical hives versus horizontal hives. He's going to discuss how to care for your bees once you catch that initial swarm, including what to plant for your bees for maximum honey production. Specific topics are time-stamped below, and if you'd like a printable cheat sheet featuring the top 10 takeaways from today's discussion, click on the first link in the description of this video and I'll email it directly to you. So go ahead and give us some background. When did you start beekeeping? You gave us a little background on yourself earlier, but specifically, when did the beekeeping come into play?
Yes, Grace, thank you. From as far back as I can remember as a child, my uncle is and was a beekeeper, and he started keeping bees back in Russia in 1972, before I was even born. And my favorite vacation was spending summers in his village, 200 miles east of Moscow, where he kept his bees. And he kept bees in both vertical hives and horizontal hives. And as a child, of course, I was more interested in honey than in the beehives. But I took a note that the older my uncle was getting, and now he is 86 and he still keeps bees, the fewer vertical hives were left because they require enough strength to handle 70-pound boxes. But now my uncle is 86 and he has a number of horizontal hives which he can still work without breaking his back. So when we came over to the US, I just wanted to have bees for my own family because we were not finding the kind of honey that I was accustomed to eating from my uncle's beehives. If we have time, we can talk about the different qualities of honey depending on the management techniques. But it was very rich, full of pollen and called bee bread, fermented pollen. And many farmers or consumers or even beekeepers in this country do not know what bee bread is and do not consider pollen fermented by the bees inside the comb as a valuable product or resource. So we started keeping bees like that. For my children, I never bought a single bee. We went from 0 hives to 50 hives by just catching swarms using boxes like this one, just a small hive that you hang on the tree in the springtime. And just as birds move into birdhouses, everybody knows that. But for whatever reason, we as a culture forgot that you can put an empty box on the tree in the springtime. For me here in the Ozarks, Zone 6 agricultural, this is this time of the year that I hang my swamp traps. And just as birds move into birdhouses, bees move into bee houses that you provide for them. Pioneers had this knowledge, obviously, because they did not have FedEx or postal service to deliver them packages of bees from Florida to Michigan overnight. So, but gradually with the bees being available commercially, people just lost this traditional knowledge and the remembrance that you don't have to pay for the bees. Everything in life, the best things in life come for free. So why should bees be an exception? So this is how it all started. I never bought a single bee. I never treated them with anything against any disease. I don't feed them sugar. And everyone around me, some people who do keep bees, were skeptical that it was even possible. But the survival rate of my bees has consistently been higher than their packaged bees that they buy every spring. Then they produce a honey crop, then they die in the winter, then they have to buy them again. It becomes very expensive. So not only I find natural beekeeping the way I do it very rewarding and it puts a smile on my face. I translated a book from the Russian language called Keeping Bees with a Smile. It got me started in this direction in addition to what I learned from my uncle. But it just explains the principles of how bees live in the wild. And even today, with all the parasites and disease and chemicals, you go anywhere in the wild, in the woods, but even in cities, bees live in human structures, in domes of churches, in siding in people's homes. So these bees are never treated with chemicals, antibiotics, they're never medicated, and somehow they're surviving. So if we know, and this has been researched and proven, that there is a very robust wild population of honeybees here in North America. So if these wild bees survive without our own, if we put this kind of tough survivor stock bees in our beehives, we should be at least as successful as Mother Nature was. So this is how I got started. And there was so much interest that we can barely keep up. I'm telling you, like, I think 12 pallets of orders left by FedEx today. It doesn't fit into a FedEx truck. They have to send a 26-foot box truck when we pack. Yeah. And I'm very glad because, I'm not, well, I do sell honey, a very expensive honey at that, no chemicals, etc. And I know there are people who value the purity and the quality of the product, not just the quantity of it. But I derive the most pleasure is when people buy some piece of equipment from me, or even download free plans from horizontalhive.com and then send me pictures of their smiling children eating honeycomb fresh from their beehives.
Yep. Scott here in the comment section says, thanks to Dr. Leo's free plans at horizontalhive.com, I built 10 swarm traps this winter. Thank you. Somebody has the first question of the night, and they said, have you heard of flow hives, and what do you think of them?
Yes, flow hives are just regular vertical hives, except one section where bees store honey is replaced with special honeycomb made out of plastic. This is not the direction I would be going first, because this setup is fairly expensive. And then I don't even package my honey in plastic. It only comes in high quality glass jars. If you look into that, plastic over time can leach into honey. So one of the reasons why in many countries they don't ever store or sell honey in plastic containers, only glass. So I know I wouldn't be able to sell my honey at $50 a pound if I was keeping my bees on plastic honeycomb. There is so much that goes into doing it right. And I think the first step is to keep it simple and the way nature intended. For example, the honeycomb that bees build from wax and propolis, the resins that bees collect from trees in the wild. Propolis is the resin that has antibacterial properties. So when bees are given the freedom to build their own honeycomb, this mixture of wax and propolis has bacteria-killing properties, so the hive stays healthier. You replace this with plastic, and this antibacterial property of honeycomb is gone, and then you have to medicate your bees, etc. So bees are a big ecosystem, and you need to realize that the farther you go from the natural setup, like using plastic comb or plastic foundation, using boxes that are not insulated for the winter. Bees live in tree hollows that have a lot of insulation. This is what they're adapted to. So every step you take away from how bees live in nature means there is more work for you to compensate for what you've broken. So I never kept bees in flow hives. I know some people who enjoy so, and I'm not saying that my system is any superior or the best, but I try to do natural beekeeping, and I abstain from keeping bees on plastic honeycomb. Another reason for that is bees modify honeycomb the way they see fit. If they need some modification for ventilation, they can poke a hole through it. You will have some honeycombs that have openings that bees chew through for traffic or for ventilation. Obviously, that's not possible to do in plastic comb, so I'm not using it. And if you have very good experiences with flow hives, please send me some pictures and your experience. I'd like to learn. But thank you for your question. I'd like to keep it simple and keep it natural.
All right, so we've got some questions that are just going to lay some groundwork here, and then we're going to get into I'm already seeing some questions in the live chat about, how to attract bees. We're going to get to that, but I'm going to just ask another simple question. Outline some advantages of keeping a hive on the homestead.
Well, first, you get honey that you know is real honey. Not many people know that here in America, about 60 to 70% of all honey consumed in the country is not produced in America. It's imported, including from China, which is the largest producer of honey in the world. I almost said manufacturer of honey in the world, because it's a very well-known concern that some of the honey coming from abroad is not even a honey produced by the honeybees. It was synthetically formulated in the lab to taste like honey, but it is synthetic honey or fake honey. When I was presenting in Europe, they told me that the official statistics is that in Europe, every fifth jar of honey is not real honey. It is labeled as real honey, but it is not. The reason for this adulteration is that every sample is very expensive to take. So supermarket chains and wholesalers cannot possibly control every single jar that gets to the consumer. And imagine if it's 20% fake honey in Europe, which is a very tightly regulated food market. I think it's even more than that here in the US. Another thing, many beekeepers are enthusiastic users of chemicals and medicines in their hives. And the moment you introduce it into a beehive, it will work its way into honey. If you search online for pesticide residue in honey, you will see articles upon articles produced by universities and USDA on the contamination of honey, including American honey, with pesticides. And what's the most striking piece of information that you will find there is that the leading chemicals that contaminate honey are not the chemicals that bees picked up from plants. You cannot avoid that if you're surrounded by row crops, but the chemicals that beekeepers themselves put in the beehive. So one of the advantages of having bees on the homestead is you know that it is honey that was produced properly. Having bees around, this will be the best pets, and they don't bark at night, and they require very little upkeep and produce honey. So I think that this educational component, letting children have contact with the bees, was one of the most important honey crops or crops for me as a natural beekeeper.
That's a good point. Now, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but I didn't know there was a difference between conventional beekeeping and natural beekeeping. Go ahead and just give an explanation of how natural beekeeping differs from the conventional, buy your bees model.
Yeah, very good. So two things. Yes. The first starts with the bees and then beehives. Let's start with the bees. In America, of course, bees were brought from Europe hundreds of years ago, but 100 years have passed, and bees have become thoroughly acclimated and naturalized in this country. And for all intents and purposes, they're part of the bigger ecosystem today. But there is a tremendous variation in the genotype of the bees. They adapt from one generation to the next to the particular environment in which they live. They have a lot of plasticity in their DNA. And there is a thing called in genetics recombination rate. When female and male parts come together, the genes are being broken up in small bits and then recombined to make a new being. So the length of the DNA strand for the honeybee that's broken and then recombined is 40 times shorter than ours, humans. That means each generation of the honeybees has tremendous diversity of their DNA compared to their parents. And this is on purpose because they are completely dependent on the environment, the blooming of the plants, the climate, the winter, temperatures, drought, etc. So they need to be very well adapted to local conditions. So if you let the bees be, like put them on an island and do no intervention, then after a number of years, bees will be knowing, quote unquote, when the flowers are in bloom. They will be really adapted to the local conditions on this island. So what happens in commercial beekeeping in America and elsewhere in the world, that it is more profitable to raise bees for sale in the South, because this is where the winters are mild. And if you are in Florida, you can start breeding bees for sale in February. All right, in March or April, these bees are being shipped, and you live in Missouri or even in Michigan, and you receive bees that were bred in Florida or Georgia or California, and they may have queens that come from Italian strain. This is the most widely spread commercial strain of bees sold in America. Italian, native to the Mediterranean climate in Europe, with very mild climate and good honey flows 10 months out of the year. So when you take bees that are not acclimated to local conditions, there are two problems that appear. First, they're not in sync with the local blooming of flowers, because if you bought an Italian queen, this colony and all of the bees in the colony are daughters of the queen. So the queen's genetics and the sperm of the drones inside the queen determines the makeup, the genetic makeup of the whole hive. So genetically, they still think that they are in the south of Italy because they're programmed to expect almost no winter, abundant honey flows, and good favorable weather 10 months out of 10. So you put bees like that in Michigan, and of course, it is the experience of most of the beekeepers that they do really well during the summer. They bring in a good crop, and then they die over winter, and you have to buy new bees in the spring. So lack of local adaptation is one big thing. But the other thing with the commercial bees is they have very low levels of disease resistance. Because when a new parasite or disease comes to America or to any part of the world, In nature, it's very harsh. The large portion of wild honeybees will die, but the fraction that remains means they have a natural adaptation to this particular parasite or disease, and they bounce back, and all of the next generations of wild honeybees descend from maybe even a handful of colonies that survive, that they have natural resistance. This is not what's happening in commercial bee breeding. Imagine if you have 10,000 bee colonies. You cannot say, oh, let natural selection take its course, let 95% of my bee stocks die because the remaining 5% will be super good bees. No, just the logic of commercial beekeeping or agriculture is such that beekeepers on a large scale are dependent on keeping their bees alive today because they have contracts to fulfill. Most of them make money pollinating almonds, etc. So they have contracts and employees and machinery and forklifts. They cannot allow bees to go through the bottleneck of natural selection. So they breed from the stock that they have, and this perpetuates the problem because natural selection is never allowed to take its course. And today, 20 years since varroa mites arrived, it is still a big problem. This parasitic mite that transmits viruses that kills honeybee colonies, it's still a problem to beekeepers in America, but primarily because American beekeepers continue to treat their beehives against the varroa mites, not allowing natural selection to take its course. So everything in beekeeping starts with honeybees, and there is this tremendous difference between the commercial bees you buy, semi-domesticated bees, and the wilds that are able to survive in the wilderness. So people ask me, what do you do for these diseases, small hive beetles and varroa mites? And the answer is, I don't do anything. Because think about it. If my bees come from a tree somewhere in the woods, living there year in and year out, the only reason they can survive there with no medication or sugar feeding is if they can adapt to these very harsh natural conditions. And if this is the genetics I have in my hive, why should they do any worse in my managed beehives? So everything starts with the bees. Now, the next step, the big difference in commercial beekeeping and natural beekeeping, the models of the hives. In Europe, when they were designing beehives back in the 19th century, and one of the famous hive designers was George de Layens, that wrote the book Keeping Bees in Horizontal Hives, they went into the woods and they measured the depth and the dimensions of honeycomb inside the bee trees and realized that for successful wintering, bees need to have a frame that's approximately 16 inches deep so that the bees can cluster on the honeycomb there and then gradually work their way up in the tree hollow or in your hive, consuming honey over the winter. But in America, the logic was all about what's more convenient to manufacture and for the beekeeper to handle. So instead of 16-inch deep honeycomb, this is the Layens frame from Europe, American standard frame is only 9 inches deep. And do you know why? Well, that's because 10-inch lumber was used for making boxes, and you put, and it's convenient for making boxes that are 10-inch. I have boxes that obviously take this size of frame, and you have to join 2 or 3 boards together. It makes it more expensive. So American frames were always 9 inches. Langstroth frame to the present day is 9 inches, just because lumber is more convenient to work when it's just a shallow box rather than the deep box. For this reason, most American beekeepers overwinter their bees in 2 boxes with a gap between the 2 boxes. And this gap between the shallow frames that are called deep in this country prevents the circulation of the bees. And farther in the north, it can lead to increased bee mortality. Because if you have 2 frames with a gap between the frames, which you have to have because the boxes are separate, then it happens all the time that if it is a very cold spell, say minus 20 degrees in Wisconsin, the bees may stay on the lower frame and not have the energy to move to the upper frame where the honey is because of the gap and starve to death. So I recommend highly the book Keeping Bees in Horizontal Hives, because back in the end of the 19th century, George de Layens was already discussing the difference of different hive models. And he was saying there are 2 pillars of natural beekeeping. First is the bees. And already back then, when everybody was starting to propagate Italian honeybees all over the world, he was saying, don't use non-local bees, only use locally adapted bees. And this still holds as #1 principle of natural beekeeping today. And the second one is use the beehives that are good for the bees and not convenient for the beekeepers. Of course, they need to be convenient for the beekeepers too. But for me, bees come first, because if you don't have healthy organisms to work with, then everything goes down the drain, because you need to use chemicals. The chemicals get into the honey. Because chemicals and sugar in your honey, you have to sell it very inexpensively. Because you sell it inexpensively, you cannot afford keeping bees in a healthy way, and it's a vicious circle. So all in all, this is the basic difference. Natural beekeeping just provides bees with the environment inside your hive, minimal intervention, no sugar feeding, no chemicals, no treatments. That allows them to live the kind of lifestyle they would live in the wild. Commercial beekeeping uses artificially bred bees that are non-locally adapted. They're dependent on your continued treatments and feedings. If you stop treating, I talked to a commercial beekeeper, if you stop medicating your bees, what would be the mortality rate? And he honestly told me that he would lose 85% of his bees in one winter. There you go. Just, for me, you look up the chemicals that are approved by FDA for putting into the beehive, and some of them, research them on Wikipedia. They are suspected human carcinogens. The theory, of course, is the concentration of this suspected human carcinogen in honey will not be high enough to cause problems for human health. But hey, my question to you, what is your level of tolerance for carcinogens in your children's honey? For me, it's big zero. So, I produce honey for others exactly the same way as I would produce honey for my own children, and I'm not going to take any shortcuts. I would rather not keep bees at all than medicate them and put chemicals in there and then sell it with a smile to other people so they can have this honey laced with pesticide. When universities did samples of American honey, on average, a jar of American honey sold at the farmer's market or in supermarket has a cocktail of 12 different agrochemicals in it. There you go.
Wow. That's case enough. So let's get to the little bit of the nitty gritty. I'm going to answer a couple of questions from the comment section, and then I have a question of my own. So Ruben asks, how do you actually catch the bees that go into the boxes?
Wonderful, thank you. So the conventional way of keeping bees is you purchase bees, and as we discussed, they're usually bred in the South because it's less expensive, and then shipped to all over the country and have no local adaptation. But for hundreds of years, actually thousands of years, bees were being attracted as swarms. Here is the life cycle of a bee colony. They live in a tree hollow or in a beehive. There is one queen, which is the female that lays the eggs, and the other are sterile workers and a few handful of drones, which are male bees. The way they propagate, it's called swarming. They raise a new queen, and before the new queen hatches, the old mother queen and half of the bees in the hive leave, and you've seen pictures, or maybe you have first-hand experience. There is a swarm of bees hanging somewhere on a branch, and what happens during that time, so it looks like a big bunch of bees hanging on the branch somewhere. And they have scouts going in all directions looking for a new cavity to live. This is how bees propagate. They split in half, and one of the half that left the nest is looking for a new place to move into. So if this time of year, in the spring, when the swarming happens, for me in Missouri, it's May and June primarily, but all the way to September, the formula for where you live is this. Take the first blooming of flowers, not just one flower, but, serious blooming of flowers where you live. Add 6 weeks, because time is needed for colonies to harvest nectar and build up population so they can afford splitting in half. So they need to raise new generations of bees, and it takes about 6 weeks. So from the first blooming of flowers plus 6 weeks, this is where you will see the early swarms flying. And the swarming season will continue all the way to 6 weeks before the first frost, because the first frost and hard freeze will kill the remaining flowers, and they will have no chance of harvesting honey to last them the winter. But even if they arrive 6 weeks before the frost, for here it will be the first week of September, they still have a chance of collecting enough honey to last them the winter. So In the spring or during the entire warm season, the swarms that emerge from the nest in somebody's beehives, but also from all of these wild colonies in bee trees and also living in human structures in suburbia or in cities, they're flying as scouts looking for a new place to live. And if you hang a box, it needs to be the volume attractive to the bees, which is 10 gallons. This is 10 gallons. And the free plans on horizontalhive.com are all about preserving the volume that the bees respect. On horizontalhive.com, there is also the free swarm catching guide that has a list of what bees prefer in a new home. But basically, it needs to be in a tree, like 10 feet off the ground, 6 feet off the ground if you don't want to climb on the ladder, because bees are very sensitive to how close it's to the ground. They don't want to being harassed by raccoons and opossums and mice and ants and bears. So being higher off the ground for them is a better protection from predators. So if you hang the box on a tree, to bees, it looks like a cavity in the tree. They go inside, they measure it, they measure the distance from the entrance to the ground by flying in spirals, which something you can see yourself. And these scouts will go back to the swarm, and if they like that box, they will bring the swarm over. In addition to the box being the right size and positioned on a tree 10 feet off the ground, it's very important that the tree is on the edge of vegetation. It is on the edge of the woods, along power line clearings or highways, in parks, in front of backyards, somewhere where the tree stands out. It was shown that if the same tree in the middle of the woods just is more difficult for scout bees to find, because scouts themselves prefer flying through open space rather than through the thicket of the forest. So the trees on the edge have great exposure to scout bees, and swarm traps on the edge of trees has high chance of catching a swarm. Hedgerows are great too. In addition to the right size and the right placement, and there is more detail on horizontalhive.com, it's very important to put the attractant that will convince the scouts that this is the best home for the bees. And this attractant is very simple: lemongrass oil. If you already have lemongrass oil, it's the same I use that you could buy in a health food store. But the important part is to put it in slow release tube. You have filled 2 tubes, you close them, and you put them inside this trap. It happens that lemongrass essential oil has chemical composition which is very similar to the bee's own attractant pheromone. If a scout finds a cavity that she likes, she will spray some of this pheromone to attract more scouts and eventually to guide the swarm by smell to this location. So if you put some of the smell there, you trick the first scout in thinking that 100 other scouts already voted and marked this cavity as attractive to that swarm, and this maximizes your success rate of catching a swarm. And between these simple things, my success rate is on average 50%. It varies from one year to the other depending on the weather, but on average, for every 2 swarm traps that I set out, 1 will have a swarm in it. And actually in areas where there are fewer trees, for example, Kansas, I get reports from people who came to my 2-day beekeeping classes and then built or purchased swarm traps to be used in Kansas. They catch even more than 50%, sometimes even 100%. Every box will be occupied because bees do not have as much choice. When I hang a swarm trap like that here in the Ozarks, there are many oak trees and bees may find cavities in oak trees. But if you live somewhere where there are not as many big trees with hollows inside, your swarm traps may even have greater success rate than here where I live. But I always recommend, because in most locations, it's not 100% success rate, hang more than 1 swarm trap. Right. And because the cost of this box really pays for itself with the very first swarm that you catch, but we have very high quality of manufacture. I think the life expectancy of at least 30 years on the box. So all the remaining years you'll be catching swarms for free. And not all of the swarms will survive. But again, this is part of the natural approach. If you wanted all bees to survive, you would have to medicate them. And nature has no place for this kind of social security, because what you do then is you are propping up non-viable swarms. I'm not saying that all of mine survive. Some of them perish. But this is what would happen in nature too. Actually, according to research out of Cornell University, up to 75% of natural swarms do not survive in the wild to be 1 year old, just because with any little animal, it's very difficult to survive the first year. You are small and vulnerable. The same applies to the bees. So do not feel that you are somehow tapping into the natural wild honeybee population and weakening them, because actually if you catch a swarm and give them a good home, the chances of survival in your bait hive is probably higher than in the wild. Of course, this box is a real beehive. Bees do not need any structures inside, no frames, etc. But we need to have the ability to then transfer them into a bigger box. Once you see bees come and go, you come in the evening, you close the entrance. This one has a ventilated opening that opens and closes. It has vents so bees don't suffocate while you're moving the swarm trap. And it does have the frames that you will install a sheet of wax in that the bees will use a foundation for building their honeycomb. And when you bring it home the following day, you will take all of the frames with the bees hanging on them as grapes. The queen is somewhere in there too, and you'll transfer them into the bigger hive. You actually have about 2 to 3 weeks to transfer them from a box like that into the bigger one. This is the volume that would be sufficient for the bees to live in, but it's not enough to produce surplus honey for the beekeeper. So if you only want to have bees for pollination, you can even leave the swarm trap in the tree and the colony would move in just as birds move into bird houses. We do not go and we do not harvest eggs from birds in bird houses. We have chickens for that. The same with the bees. If you only want bees for pollinating your garden and you don't really want to harvest honey, you could have, and I've seen people do it in Europe, to hang a swarm trap like that in a tree and just let it be occupied by bees and not harvest any honey. But if you want some honey for yourself, you need to give them more room to expand, because remember this natural cycle. They expand, and if they run out of room, they cast another swarm. They raise a new queen, and it takes only 4 weeks for a swarm to run out of room in a swarm trap like that. Because your window of time to give them bigger room, like this one, which is 14 frames, for example, or this hive behind the swarm trap, which is 20 frames insulated hive, so they can keep expanding, and then they will have a very good home for themselves, but also they will produce honey for you. Just a side note, you can keep bees in any hive model, really. I know natural beekeepers who use vertical commercial Langstroth hives very successfully. This is not as important as the genetics of the bees. But I personally chose horizontal hives. Some of the advantages I like is they have this deep honeycomb that is more natural for bees to live on. Opening a hive and pulling frames with honey doesn't involve any heavy lifting. I don't have to lift 70-pound boxes when I harvest honey. My children can be strong enough when they're 8 to help me in the bee yard harvesting honey. And then everything is accessible. If you need to check your hive for disease, you can pull a frame of brood from the brood chamber without shuffling boxes around. Bees live in cavities in the woods when everything is one big ecosystem. Any opening and separation of boxes when they're shuffled around, and sometimes a hive can have like 6, 7 boxes. So if you need to go to the lowest box to check the brood and you have to dismantle a stack of 7, first it's a lot of work, and then it also means that there is a lot of disturbance on the bee colony. But here is the snapshot of how bees are obtained. You don't need to buy local bees because there are plentiful swarms in almost all locations throughout the country. The thing is, if you can see honeybees on the flowers, that means there are honeybee colonies without the flight range of the honeybees, and you can catch a swarm in this location.
That's good. All right, so we have a question here, and it's a little bit long. Let me see if I can get it out. David says, Dr. Leo, while acknowledging that many bees now are partially mixed with Africanized bees and that this makes them robust, is there any concern about the level or mix of that strain in wild swarms, and how would one recognize this?
Yes, thank you. Africanized bees are the ones that were crossed the European honeybee with African honeybee. This was done in Brazil, and gradually they worked their way all the way through Latin America into Mexico and eventually in the United States. The good thing is that this strain of bees that is very, very aggressive cannot survive in the north. Even in Missouri, they cannot survive the winter. So if you're in zone 6 and farther north, it's not a concern at all. Even in zone 7, it's almost not a concern. like Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky. The only places where you need to be careful is places like Arizona, Florida, Texas, the very south. But even there, many beekeepers, and I have a great book I translated from French called Honey from the Earth that shows how bees are kept in 23 different countries, including the countries like Mexico, where the only bees now available are the Africanized bees. And they can be kept very productively. You just need very good protective gear and big smokers, but it can be done. Of course, you will not want to keep Africanized, very aggressive bees close to human dwellings or where they can damage livestock, but they are very healthy and very productive, good bees if you can put them away from human habitat and if you don't mind the very intense nature of interaction with them. Many bees swirling like a tornado trying to sting you. Not very pleasurable. I don't wear protection when I harvest honey from my bees, but it's doable. Again, if you do it responsibly, you can even keep Africanized bees. But another thing, if you really read in the literature, some of the Africanized bees are now becoming more gentle. So you may not even be able to tell without the genetic analysis. So I would say keeping bees needs to be with a smile. So if a hive really gives you grief and you don't want this extremely aggressive or defensive colony, just replace the queen with a stock that's more gentle. I never have to do it. I actually like the mean hives because I feel they're staying very healthy. If they can defend themselves from me, they can defend themselves from bears, varroa mites, and you name it.
Yeah. Good question here from Alan. He says, what is your opinion on top bar hives?
Yeah, I kept bees in top bar hives, and they're excellent hives in the south. There are a few limitations. So for those of you who are not familiar, what is a top bar hive? The top bar hive, where the comb is supported only by this top bar, by one plank of wood, there is no additional structure of the frame to support the honeycomb. And this is an advantage and a limitation at the same time. This is an advantage because top bar hives are very inexpensive and simple to build. They're being used in Africa where people cannot afford frame equipment. But because the comb is only supported by the top bar, you cannot make the hive very deep. It has to be very shallow. Otherwise, the weight of the honeycomb will be enough to collapse the whole comb. And because of that, top bar hives is not something I would recommend for cold climates because the depth of the honeycomb is very important for successful wintering. Another consideration is that if you have a frame, when bees build it out and fill it with honey, you can use a machine called honey extractor, which is a centrifuge that spins the frame and honey comes out without destroying wax. And then I have frames that build out honeycomb emptied of honey to give back to the bees so they can refill it without building it from scratch. It really increases honey production big time. In a top bar hive, because the comb is not supported by a frame, usually it is crushed and strained and bees have to rebuild it. So you'll be producing more wax, which may be excellent if you have a use for a lot of wax, but you will be producing less honey. Again, go for it in the south if you so desire. Another consideration is that every time you destroy the honeycomb and don't return it to the honeybees, there is less disease or bacteria returning into the hive. So this is good. It's more sanitary when you actually harvest the whole comb and crush and strain it for honey. But it's slower and certainly not as productive in terms of honey, and again, not suitable for the north at all.
All right, good one. April asks a good question here that was actually on my list, and I'll go ahead and ask it. What are the 3 most important things for someone to know before starting their hives as a novice?
I think we covered some of them. The first one is to realize that everything starts with the honeybees, and your success or failure in natural beekeeping, and I want to emphasize natural beekeeping, really depends on whether you're working with locally adapted bees or not. If you buy commercial bees and you don't mind treating them, almost putting them on intensive care, right, with feedings and medication, yes, you can prop up and keep non-adapted bees. But just be aware, first thing to be aware that you cannot keep bees naturally without having access to good locally adapted bees. Number second is that don't be afraid of the bee stings, because if you mind being stung, you can always protect yourself. Today's bee jackets, etc., are very high quality. You will not be stung if you don't want to. My daughter is now 23, almost 24, and she doesn't like the idea of being stung. Guess what? She was helping me in my apiaries since when she was a little girl, and she was never stung by a bee. But I work without gloves and without wearing protective gear, and I do not mind being stung. I have a naturopath 10 miles from here who charges you $60 to give you 4 stings. It's called apitherapy. I can get as many stings as I like at no cost. It's free bee venom medicine. And of those of you who are interested to pursue it, you can search for it. But there were people, famous beekeepers in this country, who treated thousands of people with, for example, arthritis. And this is one of the things for which bee venom and bee stings have been famous, giving stings to the inflamed joints to reverse arthritis. And another one is multiple sclerosis. You can research it, but don't be afraid of the bee stings. And number 3, realize that there is a big difference in different hives and hive models. Just if you have a vertical hive, which is a very good hive to keep bees in, realize that boxes can be very, very heavy, and just don't hurt yourself. Don't have, hernias in your spine, or hernias, or, knee replacements or hip replacements or whatever, just because you're handling 70-pound boxes during honey harvest. Make sure you have a helper to handle it if the boxes are too heavy, because your health really depends on that. I know many beekeepers who injured themselves very seriously by handling 60, 70-pound boxes without help. So I feel these 3 things, most important: work with the local bees, pick a hive of the model that attracts to you, and don't be afraid of the bees. They're not afraid of you. So don't be afraid of them.
Anna asks, do you have a few favorite plants for bees?
Plants for bees. Yes, thank you. I can recommend the book called Honey Plants of North America. If you are in North America, Honey Plants of North America. It's an amazing book. Not only it lists all the different plants and in fine detail how to plant it, how to propagate it, when they bloom, what quality honey they produce, but also there are listings by state, so you can really look it up where you live. But I can tell you where I live, my number 1 and 2 big heroes are the 2 plants that come up on forest clearings or abandoned old fields if you let it overgrow. It is sumac, a native plant, smooth sumac, and winged sumac is what we have here. They're amazing honey producers, and also they're very drought tolerant, which is important for our hot summers. And the other one that is a native plant that comes up on its own is blackberries. Also wonderful, fruit for you to have, and also doesn't require planting. You abandon a field, stop brush hogging it, and after 5 years, there will be a mixture of sumacs and blackberries, which is great for me as a beekeeper. And I can tell you from the economic standpoint, I can make more money from 1 acre of this brush than any farmer locally could make from 1 acre by running cattle here. So research your plants and, see what grows on its own and what bees visit, because it will be your cue of what is locally adapted in terms of the plants. Do not just go by the list of plants, because the same plant may be an amazing honey producer in one location and not so much in the other, because it depends on the quality of the soil, moisture, temperatures, etc. So look what bees prefer locally, and you will know what you can plant to enhance your honey resources.
Doreen has a good question. She said, we had a drought last summer and didn't have much for the bees to eat. What would you do to keep them healthy in such a circumstance?
Okay, thank you. The first answer is local bees. Again, if you memorize one thing from this hour, the answer to almost everything is local bees. And let me explain why. Honeybees have a way of not only increasing production of bees, this is called brood in the spring, the queen lays eggs and they become adult bees in 3 weeks, but they also have the ability to shut down brood production at the right time. So the bees that are locally acclimated are adapted to the local waves of availability of nectar. So if you live somewhere where I have a drought in July and August, my locally adapted bees start decreasing amount of brood production in June, because they anticipate July and August as being a dearth when there is no nectar to be had in nature. And because of this local adaptation, they don't go through a lot of honey in the summer, because they prevent the birth. They use birth control. They prevent the birth of the generation of foragers who would be useless because they would be hatching in July and August when there is no honey for them to be had. And because greatest amount of honey in a beehive goes into rearing brood, the larvae eat a lot of honey. It's not you, the beekeeper, who get the most of the honey. The larvae get the largest amount of honey that the bees collect. So if you have a locally adapted strain and they can taper off brood production in time ahead of the dearth, that means they will be much more frugal and they will not be consuming too much honey on producing more and more brood for the dearth. So again, you have to feed bees if they are starving if you already use a non-locally adapted commercial strain, but you will see the difference very quickly once you start using local bees. You'll have two hives, commercial and local. This commercial one will always require feeding because they cannot stop making babies. And this one will not require any feeding because they know when they need to expand brood, when they need to contract brood. So they go hand in hand, almost like following the waves of natural vegetation in this area. And this is quite remarkable.
I think that you answered this one, but Diana says, can the swarms stay in the swarm box, or do you have to get them into a regular beehive box?
Yeah, they will outgrow the box within 3 to 4 weeks. If you do nothing,
Okay.
they will swarm again in 4 weeks, and half of the bees will leave. So this is your window of time to transfer them into a bigger beehive.
All right, this is going to be a good question. This will probably be the last one we have time for, but somebody was asking if you could show the exact hive box that you would recommend.
Oh, thank you.
Quickly again. Yeah.
All right. So this is a very nice and economical 14-frame hive. It's $250 if you want to buy one ready-made. There are free plans for building the model on the website. But it has the same kind of frames, the European-style frames that I use in swarm traps. And there are 14 of them.
Okay.
This will provide a very good home for the bees and enough space for them to produce about 40 pounds of honey. And I have bigger models like this insulated 20-framer. If you are in the north, like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Montana, even Alaska, you need insulation inside the walls. So this is double wall with wool in the walls. So in the north, definitely go for 20-frame insulated model. There are free plans on horizontalhive.com. If you want to buy one, we have them in stock on horizontalhive.com. Thank you for your support, and thank you, Grace, for getting the word out, because I'm excited always to see when people never even heard about swarm traps. We read stories to our children as a bedtime story and don't even notice that in the Alice Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, there is a description of swarm traps. He talks about setting up boxes and trees to attract swarms in chapter 9. You can check it out tonight. But so I showed you hive. And it really is keeping bees with a smile. Small, no boxes to lift. Everything is accessible. And my 8-year-old girl has 12 hives of her own that she manages on her own.
Wow. It's okay. There's no excuse for anyone out there. Horizontalhive.com. Guys, some of you were saying you couldn't see Leo. It's totally fine. Everything he talked about tonight is at horizontalhive.com. The free plans, the 5% discount with the code April. And I think all of those books, or at least most of them that you referenced.
Yeah, thank you. This is the one to start with, Keeping Bees with a Smile. I read it in Russian language first, and I thought, wow, this is not what you read in beekeeping manuals in this country. So I served as editor of this one, and it's already in the 2nd edition. And if you are specifically interested in horizontal hives that won't break you back, then Keeping Bees and Horizontal Hives is the other. So start with these 2 books, starting with Keeping Bees with a Smile.
All right, guys. Go to horizontalhive.com for further resources. Thank you so much, Dr. Leo, for being here with us tonight. It was so much fun.
My pleasure, Grace. Thank you.